the Medical AI Podcast.
Welcome to the Medical AI Podcast with me, Dr. Felix Beecher. Strap in for a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. Donald Trump. Many love him, many hate him. But few would disagree that his second administration, only 100 days in, has already brought in political change that is truly radical. One key example is that there are now people with a strong deregulation agenda in key roles in the US government. And the single biggest question in medical AI right now is what will be the impact, both in the US and around the world. This area is not only important, it is highly complex with many unknowns, and that is precisely why I have somebody with me, not only with genuine expertise, but also with a lot of courage, Dr. Hugh Harvey, CEO of Hardian Health. Hugh, a very, very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Felix, for having me back. I'm excited to discuss the nuances of what's happening in the geopolitical realm and how that impacts on our niche of medical AI.
Absolutely, Hugh. Now, as you indicated there, you are an old friend of the podcast, but could you nonetheless please introduce yourself to the listeners and explain your involvement in medical AI regulation?
Sure. So my name is Hugh. I am a doctor by training. I became a consultant radiologist in 2014 and very quickly went into industry where I've worked at a couple of AI startups bringing regulated AI products to market. I was involved with the first European regulatory approval for a deep learning-based system. And I set up Hardian as a consultancy in 2018, seeing a gap for expertise and support in helping companies get through this kind of technical and clinical evaluation hurdle. And we've helped over 150 companies now make it to market, a wide variety of use cases, predominantly starting off with a lot of radiology devices, but now we're seeing an increasing amount, especially in the virtual reality space, the mental health space, and in cardiac imaging as well. So it's been a journey over the past few years, and the regulators like to keep us on our toes, as we will discuss.
Good. All right. Well, look, many of our listeners probably may not know very much about how medical AI systems are regulated. So let's just lay down some context. Could you give a short summary of how medical AI regulation has changed in recent years?
So the regulation around AI is applicable to all medical devices. The actual laws do not really specify much of a difference between software or AI or a normal medical device. And just as a reminder to listener, anything you use in a hospital or a GP clinic for that matter is most likely to be a medical device. Going right down to the basics, just a wooden tongue depressor. That is a medical device. Very low risk, but needs to be sterilized. So there are regulations around that. All the way up to very complex, dangerous devices like a PET scanner, a positron emission tomography scanner, which can emit radiation and obviously harm a patient if used incorrectly. So medical devices range in all sorts of capacities, from their physical components, the hardware components, to the software, and now more commonly AI. And medical devices can have software in them, or they can just be software as a standalone device. And so the medical device regulations per se have not changed that much in regards to what's known as the general safety performance requirements for any medical device. For all medical devices, AI or a wooden tongue depressor or a PET scanner, you just have to prove that it is safe and effective, and where data is involved, that it's cyber secure. And those principles underline the regulations for any medical device. What we have seen change over the past decade, let's say, is a couple of things. First of all, the regulations themselves have been updated at various points in time. one good example is the European Medical Device Directives were upgraded to what's known as the Medical Device Regulations, MDR. And they came into force, well, they were written in 2017 and they came into force in 2021. We've also had the European AI Act, which, while not specifically for medical devices, it does cover medical devices as well. So that's another piece of legislation that's coming in place. But the most change that we've seen is in the guidance. So there's a difference between regulation, which is the law as it stands, like what is legally required. And then there's guidance, which is not legally binding, but it's sort of best practice. And guidance can be released by several organizations, but one of the best known in the medical device circles is the MDCG. And they produce guidance with reference to standards on best practices. And so we've seen a lot more MDCG guidance come out over the past few years, specifically regarding software and AI. And they rely on standards. So these might be ISO standards, which are International Standards Organization standards, or IEC standards, International Electric Technical Committee standards. And so those ISO and IEC standards inform MDCG guidance, and those standards are constantly being reviewed and updated and rewritten. So just to summarize all of that, the regulations change quite slowly. The guidance has a much faster cadence and comes out more regularly. And we are always seeing more guidance and more standards come out, while the regulations are slightly slower to change.
Okay, now the rest of our discussion, I think, is going to focus on what we could call regulation stroke policy, or and particularly in the US. So could you just give a short summary of how medical AI stroke medical device regulation is done currently in the US?
Yes, so in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, are the sort of arm's length federal agency in charge of making sure that products being sold to the American public or being used in American healthcare systems are fit for purpose. And so the FDA's remit is relatively broad. It originally was just pharmaceuticals, but it extended into hardware devices, things like hip prosthesis, contact lenses, breast implants, all those kind of things. And now also covers software. It did for a time cover what's known as lab-developed tests, but that is now being challenged in court in America as well. And lab-developed tests are tests that laboratories might produce to run blood analysis through, or other human body samples through. And so the spectrum of what the FDA regulates has shifted over time, has certainly increased over the decades. AI is explicitly called out by the FDA as medical device software, or MDSW. The other acronym that's often heard is software as a medical device, but that's the European term for it, not the American term. So we'll stick with MDSW for America. And they define it the same way they define any other medical device, as if you're intending the device to be used in the diagnosis or treatment and other factors involving medical care of an individual patient, then it is a medical device. The way that the FDA works is that it is split into several subdivisions, and the subdivision that's most commonly touching these AI products is known as the CDRH, the Center of Diseases and Radiological Health, I think is the acronym, CDRH. They did a lot of the early radiology AI devices. So they have a whole team of scientists and expert reviewers who will review the submissions for software-based devices, even if they're non-radiological. So the name CDRH doesn't just mean they do radiological health. They actually do quite a broader remit than that. And since January, when the US administration changed, there have been significant shakeups at the FDA. We've seen reports of mass layoffs. Thousands of staff members lost their jobs over what's known as the Valentine's Day Massacre in our circles.
Yes, poetically.
So they had their nice Valentine's Day dinner on the Saturday, and then on the Sunday they found out they'd been laid off at zero notice, because employment law is different to what it is over here in Europe. And a lot of staff lost their jobs. But these staff are obviously the backbone of ensuring that safe devices get to market. And so there's been backlogs now forming. The FDA have very strict timelines over how long it should take them to review submissions, and some of those timelines are slipping because of the lack of staff. Some staff have been rehired. Some key staff have been rehired once they realised, they couldn't deal without that expertise. But I'm hearing that they are now effectively mandating them to be in office rather than working from home, as many of them did post-pandemic. And the offices that they have been given aren't necessarily as spacious as is required for the job. So some of them are taking calls from their cars outside in the car park and things like that. So a little bit of disruption at the FDA, I think it's fair to say. The other thing is that Donald Trump has written a lot of executive orders. And one of the executive orders, and I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember the terminology exactly, in essence said that the FDA and other agencies like it can't make new rules or laws until reviewed by some senior that Trump has appointed. And that hasn't happened yet. And so that potentially is a downstream effect for some of the novel high-risk devices, because when they get through a submission, a new rule or law is created in regards to that device type. So when you go through a PMA, a pre-market approval, or a de novo submission, the FDA actually create new special controls and new rules and laws for that type of device so that other people can then predicate on that device. And it's yet to be seen whether that executive order is slowing down the number of de novos and PMAs. Checking the FDA database just this month, so we're now at the end of April as we record this, there's only been 7 de novos this year. None have been software so far that I can find. So it looks like it may well be slowing down some of the rules and the guidance that FDA is producing. So we've been waiting with bated breath for the FDA to produce guidance on generative AI, and they did hold a public forum and a couple of days in person for people to come and give comments on how to regulate generative AI. Mm-hmm. But we've not heard any of the outputs of that, and that has been delayed as well by the administration and the effects of the layoffs and things. So, yeah, a little bit sort of up in the air at the moment in regards to the FDA. And certainly my practical experience is that when we have calls with the FDA with our clients, we usually have 3 or 4 FDA reviewers at the other end of the line, and recently it's been just 1, maybe 2.
I see. So let's come back to the FDA and the Trump administration in more general terms. But why don't we lay down a little bit more context? Because the question of regulation versus deregulation, of course, is not simply about legalities and policy measures. It's also about a broader political context, right? Could you just lay out the case from both sides very, very briefly on what deregulation versus regulation means?
Sure. I think we should take it from the baseline that everything in Western society is regulated. And when I say everything, I do mean everything. So the computer you're using, the food that you eat, the clothes that you wear, the car you drive, your bank, everything is regulated to some extent, right? And so it's a luxury in the Western world, because we have relatively well-established rules and laws, and we are relatively affluent societies. We have this luxury of being able to regulate. And why do we regulate? Is to ensure that things are safe and fit for purpose. So a level of regulation is absolutely mandatory for a functioning society. Mm-hmm. With zero regulation, society would break down incredibly quickly. So it's important to understand that in healthcare, it is an extremely highly regulated sector for very good reason, because lives are on the line. And so you have to have some kind of regulation. So when you talk about the context of a regulatory versus a deregulatory environment, you have to take it in the context that we are never, unless things go horribly wrong, going to get to a point where there are no regulations around AI in medicine. I see that as almost inconceivable as happening.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is a releasing of maybe the regulatory burden or the regulatory pressure on certain types of lower risk products. I guarantee that if an AI is going to be replacing a doctor without a human in the loop, I think any sensible person would say, well, that has to have some kind of oversight. That would be madness to let that loose without any checks or balances.
Yeah.
But I think what the deregulatory environment enables is lower risk things which have a human in the loop, which can't cause significant harm or hazardous events to patients, might see a more streamlined and less stringent regulatory requirements from regulators like the FDA. And so that's the kind of the balance that we have. Where we land in that balance is yet to be seen. Absolutely. And I don't think like we should worry that it's going to disappear completely. What we should be looking for is clarity. That's really what manufacturers want, because it's very hard to operate in an unclear legal and regulatory environment.
Now, let's think about who the key figures are who are driving the push towards deregulation in the US. Now, the way I'm kind of seeing it currently is that we have kind of very high-level figures like Donald Trump and Elon Musk who are pushing for the deregulation agenda, but then we also have people who are more directly involved in healthcare deregulation, such as RFK Jr., who's the head of the healthcare department, and Marty Makary, who is nominated to lead the FDA. Is that broadly a sensible way to look at it? How do you see those different figures in relation to the deregulation agenda?
So I think, Donald Trump obviously steers the ship, and then he has people who are refining the details around it. We'll ignore Elon Musk for now. He's not really got much to do with healthcare or the FDA. RFK Jr., I'm not an expert on, but he is normally in charge of the Health and Human Services, the HHS. Mm-hmm. And so I think his focus is more on food and drugs rather than AI, I believe. It's Marty Makary who cuts an interesting figure. He's a well-known surgeon from Johns Hopkins, I believe, and he has been nominated but has not actually got the Senate approval yet to lead the FDA. And what does that mean? Leading the FDA means you get to sort of set the FDA's agenda. And the FDA's agenda is relatively broad. It goes from research to researching the cutting edge of regulatory science to deciding what the rules and laws might be around medical devices. And he has strong opinions. He's quite known for being outspoken. He's pro-vaccine, which kind of goes against Robert F. Kennedy's central hypothesis. But he was also slightly critical of what happened during the COVID pandemic as well on some aspects. So he does have strong opinions, which is kind of different to what previous FDA commissioners have been like. They tend to speak from a position of sort of pure science and pure fact. And I think Marty Makary brings an element of politics with it on top of that, which will be interesting to see how that plays if he gets approval by the Senate when he goes for his nomination.
I think it's, from my personal point of view also, he is the first author in one of the most interesting papers I think I've ever read, which is 2016 BMJ paper, which is about the degree of medical error leading to deaths in the US, as much as 400,000 per year, which is a number which I think should stagger people. Now, point is, he is a very staunch critic of the medical establishment in general. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
Well, it's not up to me to agree or disagree with him. That's his opinion. And I think everyone's opinion is valid in this day and age. Look, we know that doctors make errors. Everyone does. As a doctor myself, I've made errors. And when those are found, you learn from them and you correct your way of working. And I think that's a sensible thing to do. And we know that humans make errors. Everyone does. And it's just part of what we call the benefit-risk ratio. So medical devices can make errors. In fact, we know that AI will make errors because no one has ever claimed an AI that is 100% accurate. That would be almost impossible to prove. There's always edge cases after all. So I think the question really is someone like Marty Makary going to make the leap from saying humans make lots of errors, therefore we should rely on AI, which is quite a big leap to make because you have to generate the evidence, surely, that the AI is more safe than the humans at doing whatever specific tasks we're talking about. And this is one of the things that sort of keeps me up at night is people talk a lot about the benefits of AI, as they should. AI is incredibly exciting, and there's lots of benefits that people can see and imagine. But it's not just the benefits we have to measure, it's the risks. And if we don't measure the risks, then we're kind of walking blindfolded into a sort of technical dystopia in medicine, where the electronic health record becomes untrustworthy because of the amount of errors being put into it. Or AI is starting to make decisions about humans that are not necessarily always correct with no human oversight. And so you can very quickly enter into quite a dangerous paradigm where proper due diligence has not been done on the risks. And so all I would say is to anyone who's making AI and wanting to go through the FDA process is you are still going to have to demonstrate the benefits. Of course you should, but you have to measure the risk. And if the benefits outweigh the risks, then there's no reason why you wouldn't get regulatory approval. The question is are they going to shift that benefit risk ratio to being slightly more risk on rather than maybe more risk adverse than we are here in Europe, for instance?
So in January, in Trump's first month in office, he revoked Biden's executive order on AI, which was very much to do with AI safety and minimizing biases and so forth, and also signed his own executive order on AI, which was kind of the opposite. It was all about encouraging innovation and reducing regulatory burdens and so forth. So those are concrete things that have happened in the Trump administration which relate to medical AI. My question, just following from what you just said, Hugh, is if you could think of a worst case scenario of what could arise from those changes, what do you think the worst case scenario might be?
I mean, I think a worst case scenario is the unimaginable, where they just essentially disband the entire FDA. But that would mean that every single drug, every single hardware device, every single piece of software used in a hospital no longer has any regulatory oversight, which I think everyone would agree would just be an undesirable place to end up.
But what do you think the worst case scenario that I think is that is realistic? Because I don't think anyone has talked about removing the FDA altogether, have they?
No, they haven't. I was being hyperbolic and doom mongering there for a minute. So I think, I don't know, a realistic worst case scenario, I don't know, it could be something that they strike off any rules and regulations around AI in particular as a medical device. They could say that all AI is hereby low risk, and therefore we are just going to use enforcement discretion, which is the FDA's way of saying we're not actually going to regulate it. We're just going to say, look, it has medical functionality, but we trust industry to self-regulate.
Yeah.
That might be a realistic outcome of this. I think it's quite unlikely, but it's entirely possible. Who knows?
And in terms of the budget cuts and the staff cuts within the health department and the FDA, what practical impact? You've already touched on this very briefly, but what kind of practical impacts do you think those are having so far and could have in the future, near future?
Well, one very tangible impact is that the FDA has historically published a list of all the AI or machine learning devices that it has given authorization to, and they've published it on their website. That list has essentially stopped being updated as of, I believe, September 2024. So we don't know what new AI devices have come to market through the FDA since then. So obviously, the staff who were involved in doing that have either lost their jobs or they've been reprioritized.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the FDA provides free pre-submission advice to manufacturers. So you can write to the FDA for a question and answer session, in essence, about your medical device, what your regulatory route might be, and have some specific questions that you want them to answer. That I've seen practically the clients are getting very slow, delayed responses. And again, like I said before, not as many FDA reviewers answering the call at the end of the line when you actually get on the phone with them. So that is also a practical consideration. I've also seen some deadlines being missed. So typically when users apply for a regulatory authorization, so let's say via the 510K pathway, for instance, usually the FDA say they'll turn it around in 90 days. 180 days. But I'm seeing that the FDA is missing their deadlines, and we've got a couple of clients who've had missed deadline letters, apologising and saying they will get on it, but no progress has been made. And then the other thing is that I've not seen any de novo or PMA AI devices make it through FDA this year in 2025 yet. So it's not clear if that's having an effect in that regard either. So yeah, a couple of real practical, tangible things. And I think it's starting to make people pause about whether or not they're going to approach the FDA with their device or not. And people are looking back again at Europe and thinking, well, the CE mark, it might be slightly more difficult to get, but at least it's clear what we have to do.
Sure.
We know what the rules and laws are, and they're not going to change imminently.
Well, hopefully we'll come back to the EU, but let's stick with the US just for the time being. Now, we're still in very early days. We're 100 days into the US, the second Trump administration. One of the parts of Trump's executive order on AI is the mandating of an AI action plan. I think there's still 3 months to go before that's published or so. Do you have any expectations about how this is going to play out over the next 3.5 years?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm sorry, Felix, but
I know.
it's anybody's guess. I would hope that there are sensible people who would be advising and pushing back on full deregulation.
Yeah,
I think I have many colleagues who work at the FDA who are very, very intelligent and are there because they want to make a difference and they want to make sure that devices, especially AI devices, are safe. And I think that in the government's searching for answers, they'll be hopefully talking to these stakeholders and getting an idea of what's happening also around the world, because we can't forget that America doesn't exist in isolation. And they will be arguing that actually internationalization of standards, and the FDA has always been seen as one of the leaders internationally.
Yeah.
That the FDA should try and maintain that position and be as attractive as possible as a market. I think the other thing is that you have to remember the FDA is funded by what's known as user fees. So a user fee is a fee that a company pays when they apply for their FDA submission. And so it's hard to see that the government would cut that part of the FDA because it is essentially at least breaking even, if not profit making for the FDA. Mm-hmm. So I think hopefully all of that put together would mean that the parts of the FDA that look at AI currently hopefully will stay as they are, and hopefully the FDA will maintain its position on the international committees that it's on. I know it's been asked to withdraw from the WHO. I know that the FDA briefly sat out of the IMDRF, which is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, but I believe they're back in the conversation now.
Uh-huh.
And the FDA could also theoretically leave what's known as MDSAP, which is the Medical Device Single Audit Program, which is sort of a quality assurance mechanism that multiple countries accept, and America could leave that. There's other factors at play, is that we're waiting for final rules on what's known as quality system regulation, which is the FDA finally accepting ISO 13485, which is the International Quality Management System standard. The FDA has all but accepted it. We're just waiting for the final rule, but that's obviously been delayed by all of the things that are taking place politically. So there's things happening, but we could see the FDA step away from those international committees and obligations, which I think would be a massive shame.
However, at the same time, there must be many players in this area, medical AI, who are cautiously, no doubt, but nonetheless welcoming the prospect of deregulation, especially smaller players, I would imagine, because it means that those barriers to entry potentially are lower. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that anybody can build software, as opposed to, for example, a drug, means that the barrier to market entry is a lot lower for these products. You very rarely, if ever, hear of a startup these days saying, I'm going to make a new drug. Yeah. And the reason they don't do that is because how do you compete with the 4 or 5 massive pharma companies that exist in the world and their huge budgets. You can't. And so the software world is much more attractive. It's much more fast paced, and things at the cutting edge change very, very quickly, which kind of suits a smaller, more agile team rather than a massive conglomerate. But that said, the regulations don't really care, to put it frankly, about the size of your budget or the size of your team. They care that the product itself is safe and effective. And no matter how fast or agile or small you want to be, or indeed you are, you still have to meet those minimum barriers. That's the kind of the ethical North Star that any startup should be facing. Now, of course, if you are a small startup who's never been regulated before, and none of your team members have ever produced a regulated product before, and then you hear that America is going down this deregulatory route, that can obviously seem attractive, but it will come with quite big caveats in that you are then entering a market which, in essence, let's say they remove certain regulations. You are then in an unregulated environment. You have to prove your worth against all the other players who have just as easily entered that market. So it makes it incredibly competitive. There's no moat formed by having a regulatory approval because everyone else can just walk it straight in the door behind you. So I don't know if that necessarily is as attractive as it sounds. I think actually if you play the long game and actually get a medical device, especially through a de novo or pre-market approval in America, you do have quite a large, substantial moat in terms of blocking out your competitors who haven't necessarily done that. So I think there's pros and cons to the deregulatory angle. The other thing is intellectual property, which is hardly ever touched upon, but I think it's fairly important, is that if you go through a regulatory approval like a pre-market authorization, a PMA, you can quite easily claim a patent on the process that you've developed. Whereas if you do like a 510K, which is based on a predicate, i.e. you say I'm the same as someone else's device, it's quite hard to then claim that you own the intellectual property as well. So by removing regulations, by removing the higher risk authorization processes, you create quite an unclear intellectual property environment for these smaller startups who then may struggle to own their intellectual property.
I see. Okay, well, it brings us very nicely actually onto the global picture. Now, the FDA is probably by a bit of a distance the most influential regulatory agency in the world. Do you think that other countries will continue to follow the lead of the FDA, or do you think that it might tend to break the FDA apart from other countries in some sense?
I think it will isolate the FDA if they go too far. Because, as you say quite correctly, they're perceived as sort of the leading medical device regulator globally. But a lack of clarity really does not help a thriving market. And I think you only have to look at continents like Africa. So South Africa has just beefed up its medical device regulations, and it's joined MDSAP, which is the committee that I spoke about earlier about quality management systems being harmonized. And I think you could quite easily see that other countries will become more attractive, where they have clear guidance, clear regulation, less of that sort of, political risk involved with it, and in a less competitive market. So I think you could see America, in terms of its medical device regulation, becoming slightly isolated. The second thing is that the long tail of it all is if you do end up deregulating a lot of these things, the patients will end up coming to harm. There will be black swan events where AI causes massive cybersecurity issues. There will be cases of AI getting multiple patient details wrong in their records, or inaccuracies in the performance of these AI devices. And it will be very, very difficult to untangle and unwind from that. So I think it would, two factors. It will isolate the FDA. It will allow others to leapfrog, catch up, overtake. And also it will create a more dangerous environment within healthcare systems within America. I
see. Okay, so you've talked about two separate issues there. firstly, clarity, and second, deregulation. Now, do you see those two things as separate or related?
You can be very clear in your deregulatory intent. You could say, I'm being very clear that no AI is going to be regulated. So yes, that would be clarity, but then it comes to all the disadvantages I've just spoken about. I think what I mean really is that what people want is clarity at the cutting edge. So, we've had generative AI now for a few years, and really the FDA have said pretty much nothing about it. At least, that could be taken as formal guidance. And I think what people want is absolute clarity, because that allows people to make decisions, to put money behind business decisions, and actually go for clearances or regulatory clearances when appropriate. And I think that's the kind of clarity that I'm talking about.
Do you think, though, there is some sense in which the regulators in the EU or administrators in the EU will be looking at the US and feeling some kind of pressure to follow suit to some degree?
That may be true. I don't think they're doing it out of deference to the FDA. I think they might be doing it more because of the feedback of their own regulatory systems, is that it is probably slightly too burdensome for smaller companies right now. And I know that the EU Commission has publicly said it is going to review some of the medical device regulations in Europe, but that's going to take several years to make any changes. So I think, yes, the pressure gauge may come down in Europe over time, but I don't think it will be as a direct consequence of copying what the FDA does.
Hugh, it's been such an interesting conversation. It's such an important issue, and it's an absolute pleasure to discuss it with somebody with such expertise. So I'm very grateful to you. And there's one last question, and that, of course, has got nothing to do with any of this, potentially at least, and that is your favourite example of medical AI system. So I'm going to ask that question again. We're okay for time, aren't we? Hugh, one last question. It's been such a pleasure talking to you about this. That is, what is your favourite current example of a medical AI system?
On market or going to come to market? Because I've got a couple, to be fair.
You can take the question however you like, Hugh.
So I'm quite interested in the Korean market at the moment, South Korean market. Not only have the regulators actually produced guidance around generative AI, which is the kind of a world's first. No other regulator has really kind of come out with any guidance around how we might validate and regulate generative AI as a medical device. But there's actually a South Korean company called Soombi who have actually got ethical approval to do a trial of, I believe it's a chest X-ray reporting AI. So the input would be a chest X-ray and the output would be a full report. And they're actually going to do a trial. So I think that's quite exciting. So that's probably my favorite example. Pre-market.
Do you mean a full report including some kind of diagnostic in there?
Yes, I believe so. So that's incredibly exciting. And I think on market, I think you'd have to look to the UK. We had the world's first class 3 regulatory approval for a skin cancer detection AI device. And it's class 3 because there's no human in the loop when it's making decisions about whether a lesion as photographed needs to be seen by a dermatologist or not. And it's making that decision autonomously. And I'm actually quite surprised there aren't more class AI devices on market, because I think that's really where the big impact of AI lies, is actually doing something instead of a human doing it. Not just sort of cheating and relying on a human to look at the output. It's actually saying, no, we're so good and we're so reliable, we're actually just not going to have a human in the loop. But obviously that's a class 3 device.
And the name of that, the name of the device and the company is what, Hugh?
The company's called Skin Analytics. I'm not sure of the specific name of the device. I think it's called Derm, actually.
Fantastic. Hugh, it's been such a pleasure talking with you again. Very grateful to you. Thanks. Come on again, by all means.
Thank you so much for having me, Felix.
Okay. Cheers, Hugh. Talk to you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Ping me on LinkedIn if you have any ideas on new subjects or guests.